My name is Daniel Safarik. I am the CTBUH journal editor and actually the director of the China office of the CTBUH as well. I did live in New York for 6 years from 1998 to 2004, and every time I come back, I'm completely shocked by the change that I've seen. I want to introduce the panelists that we have convened here today. We have Kai-Uwe Bergmann, who is a partner at Bjarke Ingels Group. We have Scott Frank, who is a partner at JBB, MEP firm. We have Russel Unger, who is the executive director of the Urban Green Council in New York, and Tom Wright, the president of the Regional Plan Association. Our topic today is really a very wide-ranging conversation about the future. We're basically assembled to speculate on what New York of 2050 will look like. I think, obviously, this being a tall building organization, we will talk about the skyline, but it's going to extend to a lot more than that. So I think it'll be really interesting. Just to give you an opening statement, and then I'll ask each of the panelists to give about 3 minutes of opening statement as well. Then we will proceed into the panel portion, and we'll have a substantial portion for audience Q&A afterwards. So the essential premise of this panel is that we've got an increasing amount of extreme environmental events that have brought into question the survival of many urban centers. As you know, many of them are coastal. I just read a prompt today on New York Times that Greenland is definitely shrinking because of the ice is melting. We just don't know how fast. So, we don't have to go to Greenland. It's coming to us. That's kind of the situation that, coastal cities are in. So we've clearly had quite a few extreme events here in New York, even in the last couple of decades, that have made us aware of our vulnerability. It's not all going to be doom and gloom, but I think we need to talk seriously about the solutions that we can devise as people who are shaping cities. So I'm going to now have Kai-Uwe Bergmann give his opening statement about the subject, which is basically, where do you think New York will be in 2050?
As Daniel just mentioned, he was living here in New York for a number of years. We actually, and myself included, just arrived about 5 years ago to New York. But what is remarkable about this city is that when you sort of live here, you're adopted. You become a New Yorker. And you feel a certain, I think, responsibility to contribute to this city in a meaningful way. And so from the very first day to today, we have made a very sort of active, concerted effort within BIG to be actually involved in some of the very critical discussions concerning the city. And so we right now are working in 3 of the 5 boroughs, so 3 of the 5 sort of neighborhoods, and are really interested in actually looking at how, through the work that we do, we can start to impact and sort of act as a catalyst for these sort of, I would say, necessary kind of changes. One of which is, of course, sea level rise, and that any coastal city, no matter where you're from, if you're along the water, you need to sort of deal with sea level rise over the next 100 years and beyond. And that's something that we also have taken sort of as a topic that's very, very important to think of holistically, the region. And I'm actually really happy to have the RPA sitting here because it's a very rare institution that I think very few cities actually have around the world that look at the entire region and sort of create comprehensive plans for the city and its inhabitants. So we feel like we are new kids on the block, but we're very, very excited to be able to work and thinking about what is a New York of 2050. What is the New York that we would like to sort of live in, work in, and play in?
Great, fantastic. Thanks. Scott?
Thank you. I'm going to make a couple comments from somewhat of a narrow perspective. I've had the privilege of being an engineer, consulting engineer in this market in New York City for almost 30 years. And there's something happening in the office tower market or the office building market that I think is really fascinating. And I think that'll be a big part of what the city looks like in terms of the skyline for sure in 2050. And I start with somewhat of a pessimistic premise, which is that I'm not sure the office market in New York City is really working very well anymore. In spite of the very large projects that you all have heard about and seen in the cityscape these last couple of days, we have developers in this town on record saying you really can't make money developing office space in the city anymore. We saw yesterday the trend in gross square feet of office space created per decade is flat or trending down. At the same time, we have interesting artifacts of Google spending $2 billion on 111 8th Avenue, a horizontal industrial building in a Class B market. As a result, we have rents in Class B buildings in that area exceeding Class A office rents. In the meantime, what the office market is doing is inching along with ever-present incremental improvements to their product offering. A little more glass, another 6 inches in a ceiling, different stone in a lobby. And I guess the question I would ask you all to think about, and my observation is that we're not serving the market anymore. The project Kai's designing downtown at the World Trade Center right now, that tenant, they don't want ceilings. Forget about 9'6" or 8'6", or there's a completely different need, it seems, from the market that really is not being responded to. This is exacerbated, of course, by cost of corn shell construction in New York City has doubled in the last 10 years. That's a 7% compounding rate. And I don't think these buildings are fundamentally sustainable as they're currently being offered. And a real liability for this, folks, is that the stated economic plan for New York City is to continue to attract and retain fast-growing, small startup companies, which are media and technology related. They don't want to be in their parents' midtown office building. It's clear they want to be in funky Class B space. And what happens when we start to run out of that space if the market is trying to push them and sell them Class A space as we think about it today that they really can't afford? So I think it is potentially the future in 2050 could be very different in that the industry and this sector is really ripe for a classic disruption that we've seen in so many sectors infused by technology and software. So I think it's very exciting, with a lot of questions to be asked, in the years to come.
Great, thanks. Russel?
Sure. I mean, 3D printing of buildings.
Could be.
So 2050 has like a special resonance if you're involved in environmental issues, because that's kind of the big target, the International Panel on Climate Change. The developed world is supposed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by then. So we actually give a lot of thought to 2050. We've actually modeled out the city to 2050. And when I think about 2050, I think about it in a few respects. I try and think about what are people, the average person, thinking about, and how that affects the market. What's the industry's capabilities, and what do buildings actually look like? And in 2050, I don't imagine a Shangri-La scenario where everyone is walking down the street thinking about the carbon footprint, but we are probably going to see more storms in New York. Resiliency has had staying power that's surprised me. I still hear about resiliency. You hear it from community groups around the city. So the extent we will get future hurricanes, we will see storm surges, that people have made the jump from that to climate change, and so that's put climate change on the political agenda in New York in a way that is pleasantly surprising for those of us working on green building. So that's the first thing. So I think we'll see people still concerned about resiliency, even more so. That's going to put staying power for political attention in New York to climate change. When it comes to industry, I think we're seeing a shift towards more performance-based metrics. We're seeing, for example, the energy code coming online in New York next year is going to start doing air leakage testing in residential buildings, small residential buildings. Contractors right now are supposed to have airtight buildings, certain standards. No one's ever tested it. That performance testing is going to lead to dramatic changes in behavior. And as we shift more towards that, as code enforcement has become a lot more sophisticated, I think we're going to see a natural improvement in the building stock. And then in terms of the building stock itself, one of the things that's also great about thinking not just the next 5, 10 years, but the next 35 years is there is a natural turnover rate. Office spaces are renovated. People upgrade their homes. And as they do that, they'll upgrade them with new systems. And there's an opportunity to get that right. And I think maybe the biggest policy question when it comes to green building and energy use and climate change in a city like New York is what the balance ends up coming between improved efficiency of buildings, which is one way of reducing carbon, and improvement in increase in green supply, which is another way to reduce carbon. And what the balance is there is going to be an economic point where it pays to have more green power rather than trying to squeeze more efficiency out of buildings. So we're nowhere there yet, but where that point is will have a major impact on what we see from buildings in the future.
Great.
Wow. Okay, to try and follow up on all that. So like Russell's group, Regional Plan Association, I mean, we're in the business, as Kai said very generously, we're in the business of thinking out a generation. And in the 20th century, we did 3 long-range plans for the tri-state metropolitan region, thinking about New York City, but also all of Long Island, the lower Hudson Valley, southwestern Connecticut, and northern New Jersey. In the 1920s, we put out a plan that talked about kind of expanding infrastructure into the region because we needed highways and roads to take advantage of the new technology of the automobile and to decongest the overcrowded urban center. In the 1960s, we did a second plan that was now worried about the emptying out of our urban centers, and we started to talk about how do we protect and preserve our watersheds, our ecological landscapes, and how do we try and kind of help the urban poverty and the people left behind. And in the 1990s, we did our third regional plan and started to talk again about building infrastructure, but this time it was all about mass transit and trying to kind of figure out how to reinvigorate the urban centers. We are working now, we're in the middle of a process of doing RPA's fourth regional plan, which will look out 25, 35 years. And so we're thinking a lot about what New York and the region, the metropolitan region, will look like in the middle of this century. And I think there are a couple key things. One is climate change, obviously. It was not an issue in the 20th century to think about with these cities. And in fact, we were very successful late in the 20th century and over the last couple decades, putting people, reclaiming the water's edge, reclaiming the industrial waterfront with housing and other things. And now we say, my God, have we put people in harm's way? And so figuring out how to deal with that and the climate change is a huge issue. There's also, of course, technology, and the changing technology, whether it's kind of social media and the way we can do business interactions to autonomous vehicles and dramatic reductions, we hope, in our greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions through cleaner and greener energy and things is really dramatic too. But the third, I'll just say on a kind of social level that maybe is driving all of this too for us, is that 20 years ago when we did our last plan, we were still trying to argue to the suburbs, which had experienced a generation plus of robust growth, that New York City still mattered. And that we had to kind of go to folks in Long Island and the Hudson Valley and say, New York is still really important to you. Of course, what's happened over the last 20 years is a complete inversion of that. New York City is decoupling from the rest of the region, in some ways from the rest of the country. 90% of the jobs over the last 25 years in this region have occurred here in New York, and the highest paying and best jobs here. And we see the demand for that continuing pretty much unabated to the degree that we can provide the infrastructure and the housing and even the office space, although I think, again, that's probably less of a limiting factor than the infrastructure and the housing. And so building that capacity and what it looks like and how we address the water's edge and protect ourselves and also connect communities is going to be, I think, the critical challenge that we're going to face over the second half of this century. We can't have the kind of great density and concentration of humanity that we've had unless we can move people around within those systems. As folks may know, if you've ridden the subways here, they have, I know New York from 1970, and I can remember when you were lucky if the doors opened on the trains or they didn't catch fire, and they were all kind of scary, and Central Park was a pretty scary place after dark and things too. We have done incredible improvements in the city, but it was all based on kind of latent capacity that we had. Our transit ridership has been off-peak, reverse commute, and we're packing people in. And so we don't have the space to do that anymore in that system. And I think on the housing demand, we just anticipate, I mean, essentially commercial is now a loss leader to keep feeding the housing market, because we don't see any slowdown in the demand, and everybody knows about the millennials or the baby boomers or the continued global migration patterns mean that more people want to come and live here, and they're bidding up to an extraordinary degree. So I think that we really have a challenge right now in front of us to either confront these kind of limiting factors and figure out how to address those issues, or we're going to start to see, and earlier this year, the official agency that does long-term population and employment projections for New York came out. It's called NIMTIC, and they came out with their projections. And essentially, they see the city kind of continuing on this robust growth trend for 10 years, and then it just plummets. And I think that's a kind of decision that the policymakers made, that we wouldn't have the capacity to continue that level of growth. And they actually predict over a 25-year period, essentially half of the growth rate that we experienced over the last 25 years. And so that's the challenge. That's the kind of business as usual and status quo that we all have to push back against. And I think that's what we're trying to do with RPA.
Well, thank you all. That really sets the stage. And it obviously will give us, I think, more than enough to talk about in the time we have. So I think I'm going to try to move through these questions in a kind of a question of scale. So, we start with the largest, broadest scale issues, which is, of course, we're global citizens. We're part of a global situation of climate change. And I want to localize that a little bit because of New York's specific condition as a coastal city with certain topography. So the question would be, how will the street levels, the shoreline and their interaction with the rest of the built environment be different from what we now have today, given what we know about the expectations of climate change, ocean levels, et cetera? And then what impact will this have on the built environment and our transportation infrastructure in reaction to that?
I could talk transportation, but maybe Kai should talk more about the street design, the architecture side of things.
Sure. So I think it's really interesting after Sandy, because you can start to see how resiliency actually works and functions. You can imagine that the insurance companies that have to pay the big bills and the reinsurers actually are requiring each individual building owner to make their plot resilient. That then impedes, to some degree, a kind of collective response, because really everyone is just sort of thinking of themselves. So what we have, I think, in New York is kind of an immediate individual response, and then now longer-term collective responses. And there are hundreds of responses. The big U, or the dry line, is one collective response that came out of a year-long kind of rebuild by design effort that was led by the national government, not the state and not the city. But basically the Obama administration said, we have $5 billion. We would now like to, instead of just creating a bunch of Band-Aids, we want to actually think proactively how to spend these $5 billion. We don't want to do it in one area, we want to do it across the entire area that has been affected by both Superstorm Sandy as well as other climate change affected areas. So what I think is a very sort of local New York kind of response is that, it's about what a building can do. Floodgates, placing mechanical equipment on higher floors, waterproofing certain pieces that are underground. But imagine, I'm just asking you to imagine if every single high-rise tower in Lower Manhattan is each spending several million, $5 million, $10 million to basically waterproof and sandy-proof their properties, how much money we're actually putting on the table versus a collective response that would deal with the edge of the coastline or would look at cloudburst kind of responses where we're talking about a lot less actual cost-benefit investment. But these are the things that it's just the way that basically cities are structured, financing is structured, and the political system and process works. So to answer that question, I would say there is that the collective response would look at streets, would look at the edges, the open spaces that are affected by sea level rise. But in our world, it's more important the actual ownership of property that drives a lot of the responses.
Yeah. To piggyback on that, I'd say I think there's an interesting parallel at the federal level also, which is, you know, the kind of famous quip that our federal government is essentially an insurance company with an army, because we're kind of standing, you know, pat on surface transportation bill, HUD funding, CDBG, rebuild by design, which was an extraordinary process aside. There's not a lot of kind of creative thinking or growth in the federal budget for this kind of thinking, except there's one agency that's probably seen quite a lot of growth over the last couple of years, and we'll see a lot more, and that's FEMA, because we don't do any of this kind of proactive thinking, but after a disaster. I mean, people ask me, how are we going to pay for the new tunnels under the Hudson River? The Northeast corridor flooded during Sandy. Like the water went down and flooded those 105-year-old tunnels, and they are now falling apart. And that is the only way to take a train from Boston to Washington or New Jersey to New York, and that system is falling apart. And while we kind of dither and try and figure out how to fix that, probably what's going to happen is the existing tunnels will go out first, and then Congress will have to step in with a big check, but it'll take us 5 to 10 years to restore service. And so that's kind of where we're at. So it's a similar thing. I just think that we're doing this piecemeal way too often, even nationally, and not thinking about what would the kind of common response. And hopefully this is an area where, because of rebuild by design, and New York's kind of unique, both its standing, its economic power, and its topography, there are opportunities to do some collective investments that may make New York kind of be a leader in terms of sustainability and resilience, and that maybe we can start to kind of lead the way for the rest of the country on this.
And I would want to piggyback a bit on that statement about the status of our infrastructure and particularly with respect to transportation. We actually saw some pretty interesting proposals for both from our student competition that came in for the conference here, as well as some real life projects like the one that's happening right across the street here at Grand Central, where we're seeing the skyline that's advancing becoming an integral part of the transportation network. Absolutely. Which isn't a new idea, because that's sort of what Grand Central was originally envisioned to be. But you know, the thinking has gone back now into, can we get concessions out of developers? Can we get them to sort of concede some of their as of right developments and actually give something back that's more meaningful than a plaza, you know, around the building? So that's pretty interesting. So in that context, I would ask any of you of what kinds of new integrations of transportation and tall buildings can we expect to see by 2050, given the conditions that are a little bit ominous?
I mean, yeah, I think One Vanderbilt was an extraordinary project, and it's kind of relearning. This is essentially, you know, giving the developer, SL Green, a larger building footprint and an extraordinary, I think, iconic tower, but also they're investing in the Second Avenue, East Side access, and kind of fixing up the subway connections. And it's not just the amount of money. This was a one-time opportunity. The MTA, the city, is building a connection to bring the Long Island Railroad into Grand Central, and we can either integrate it with the buildings that are going in now or kind of never have that opportunity again. And obviously, this is a place where we are way behind the rest of the world. I mean, we look to Hong Kong or other, even London. other cities are doing a much better job of integrating land use planning and economic development with the infrastructure investment that they're doing. And I would say we are also way behind in doing the level of investment that we need to do. I think that there's also, though, maybe people don't pay much attention to this. Earlier this year, the Fulton Center opened in Lower Manhattan. It's a wonderful transit hub that connects a bunch of subway lines that used to be just a nightmare to try and connect to. The 7 extension out to the west side has opened up. Ridership is down because Hudson Yards isn't online yet, but believe me, as that starts to come online, it's going to be extremely robust. They say it'll be late next year. It'll probably be more like 2 years from now, I guess, but the first phase of 2nd Avenue subway will open up from 63rd Street to 96th Street. The first new trunk for several generations in the subway line. By itself, the day it opens, it'll start carrying more people on the Chicago or the Boston or the Washington systems, all by itself. The Calatrava station downtown, which has been wildly over budget, but is going to be extremely beautiful, is going to come on. We're going to look back like 2 years from now, and then East Side Access, which is perpetually 8 years off, but eventually we'll get that. But just 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to look back and say we just went through a period where we had this incredible expansion and kind of improvement in the infrastructure capacity in New York City. And my hope is that the public and developers and the politicians will say, you know what, we got to build on this, and we got to keep going with it, and that we'll start to see more integration between these two. And financial integration, of course, is critical to the funding side. But people talk about how we don't have the money to invest in infrastructure. That's crazy. You know, every penny we put on a gas tax in this region generates something like $100 million a year. We could raise the gas tax just in the 31 county area. It would generate $1 billion a year, and that would pay for a lot of infrastructure. Putting some damn tolls on the East River bridges, that's $1.5 billion a year. I mean, money every single year. That money is there. We just have, I think the politicians are afraid of doing it because they want to keep themselves at arm's length from this, and the public has been opposed to it because they don't see the benefits accruing. And my hope is that between kind of the concerns that as more storms hit and more of our subways get flooded and things happen like that, and then as these projects come online and people start to see the benefits, hopefully we can start to build some real outcry for doing more of this, because I think we're going to have to.
Right, and I mean, the other thing I wanted to address was just the idea that the expansion of public space at multiple levels in the city is becoming something that's starting to take hold, which is interesting. I don't know how that will ultimately manifest itself, but you know, I go back to the thinking about, I was at the Empire State Building yesterday for the reception, and thinking about how anybody thought they could get a dirigible to dock on that thing. It'd be kind of beyond me, but it did get me to thinking about novel ideas of transportation and integration. And as you pointed out, we're well behind where we should be based on the rest of the world, major cities in the rest of the world. So I guess a question would be, you know, how is it going to look different, you know, how do we get a political class sort of set up that can deal with these issues and respect requirements for public space and for, you know, public safety? Because in some ways those are oppositional if you look at solutions that are very sort of ham-fisted, like let's just put a giant wall around the base of World Trade Center, you know, but what kind of public space does that make? So, the question is just, yeah, how do you engineer that?
Well, of course, you know, the problem is, it's a national problem, right? The prerogative towards infrastructure in the U.S. in general, right, has been, you know, very difficult, right? The surveys every year, how antiquated and at risk so much of the national infrastructure is. And then the New York City specific dynamic is also complicated by city government versus New York state government. I don't know, many people run from this area would realize that the New York City subways are not controlled by city government. So you're relying on a state government with a lot of other stakeholders, right, from primarily not an urban market or urban context. And so, you know, it just compounds, it seems, the challenge of arriving at had political class fortitude, right, to put in place this kind of long-term planning.
Yeah, I wonder how far away we are from a regional government. I mean, Portland is 3,000 miles away. That's the closest example I can think of in the United States where they've actually attempted this.
I don't think that a regional government is actually, I used to think my goal should be to put myself out of business and try and create some public agency that would do what RPA does. Because there is no public sector entity that looks at the entire metropolitan region. We have a port authority that's by state. We have an MTA that's 2 other states. We don't have any kind of coordinated governance. But actually, I think it is more complicated. I mean, London has had enormous success over the last 15 years since they restructured their governance. But part of what they did was they created Transport for London and gave the mayor control over the tube system. And they instituted the congestion charge, of course, to generate more money. But I think they would say that Crossrail and the other major investments only came about because of the integration of the kind of land use and economic development planning with transportation planning, which we don't have because the MTA, as you say, is essentially a state entity. In some ways, what we've seen is we lack kind of coordinated planning across the metropolitan region, but we also lack, because we have these vertical structures that have enormous inefficiencies. I mean, where the path system probably costs more to move a person a mile than any other transit system in the world. And our projects go way over budget and take way too long. And part of that is because they're kind of each in a silo that doesn't have to compete. We've seen other cities where they separate out the operations from the planning and financing, and we probably ought to be thinking more along those lines.
Very interesting idea. Speaking of things that are tall and vertical and inefficient, we have a massive amount of building stock from the 1950s in this city, which the office market is kind of trying to figure out what to do with. You've got the low ceilings, you've got the single pane windows that are very difficult to replace because of the curtain wall systems. We are now at that point where we're grappling with reconfiguring that stock or just tearing it down and replacing it. That obviously raises a lot of sustainability questions in and of itself. But how do you see this trend resolving by 2050? Because if you talk to the developers who were on the panels, in the previous day here, they have their solution, which is build more new towers. But I'm wondering if you have different thoughts.
Well, I think it's going to be a mixture of things. I mean, we're not going to knock down all of East Midtown, Manhattan, and replace it with new towers. And right now, as you may have heard from other sessions, there's a significant kind of zoning impediment to doing that right now. Most of those buildings are built larger than they're allowed to be built now. So if you knocked it down, you actually could you would not be able to build as big a building as you have now. So I think we're going to see, zoning is one of those, zoning has cost the city a larger building infrastructure cost, but aside from that, there's not a direct cost the way property tax abatement is. So zoning is one of these policy tools you can use to advance things like affordable housing, like sustainability. So I think it's one of those tools that the city will be tapping to encourage kind of next generation, highly efficient buildings, and that will be part of the answer in East Midtown. And for much of it, though, I think it'll be upgrade to the existing stock. And I've heard a lot about the ability of the structure to support, better curtain wall. I mean, the UN building, same generation, one of the earliest curtain wall buildings, they solved that problem by going straight through to like the substructure and attaching the curtain wall to substructure. So structural engineers in the room can help me with this, but if the UN building can do it, probably we can be adding, double glazing onto those buildings, and I think most of them will do that. And of course, the other major factor is emptying one of these buildings is extraordinarily expensive. You need to, you're not going to have all the leases lined up in any period, so you have to get tenants out, and any period you have the building empty is just a massive drain. So owners are really it's going to be a very last decision for most owners, and it's going to be, I think, the exception that totally renovates it.
And it's even exacerbated by the fact that, with current best practices, cost of labor, the cost you're talking about to renovate a Class B building requires a Class A rent to pay for the investment. And one thing the last, recent generation of, you could say in the last 10 years of office towers have done is really kind of bifurcated or reinforced that boundary between modern Class A and Class B. The floor-to-ceiling glass, higher ceilings, all those finishes, elevator service. There's really now a critical mass of that building infrastructure. And so the perception by tenant markets, which you'll hear from brokers, is very significant. So it's, there was a lot of talk years ago about reskinning entirely these buildings, all these 50s era curtain wall buildings, the first curtain wall buildings, many in the world. The economics don't support many of those projects. So again, it sounds like we have an opportunity, there's a real market need for some very innovative approaches to how retrofit interventions happen in buildings, because with the current kind of market capability, you just can't see how it's really viable at scale.
I think the challenges we're seeing in that particular market also point to the importance of decisions that are made now for the future. So what you build your facade out of, the floor plate, you're not going to be able to change those fundamental things without knocking down the building. And from a sustainability perspective, I mean, that's the concern for high glazing now. But that's some of the things we need to be conscious of. There are certain things that we can redo. We can redo all the mechanical systems. We can redo all the lighting. But the facade, the floor plate, these are things that are going to be around more or less the length of the building.
We've spent a little bit of time on the sort of the engineering and infrastructure and a little bit on the policy implications of the public and the private relationship. I wanted to go a little bit into the economic and social issues. You can't really turn a page reading about architecture and design and development in New York without seeing something about the pour door, the billionaire needle, the shadows cast across Central Park in the name of lock boxes in the sky. So the skyline of 2050, forget about what it's going to look like in terms of its shape. What is it going to look like in terms of mixed income, mixed use, social equity, some of these more amorphous concepts that obviously have a real implication in the built environment? Is it going to be Blade Runner, Elysium? What movie is it going to be of the dystopian or utopian future?
I'll take a whack at it. I was talking about this. I mean, they're kind of there's some folks I know who argue that there's a kind of correlation between the number of tall towers and very tall towers in a building, and essentially it's inequality, and that the more tall, because you don't see poor people living in these very great buildings, and that there's a kind of that cities that have more skyscrapers in them tend to have kind of a greater degree of inequality and a greater range between the haves and the have-nots. And I don't know, I understand there are like economists who kind of are studying that and trying to do research. I would caution kind of assuming causality between just what might be a correlation, but there's certainly kind of something there. And I do think in New York City, whatever, I tend to kind of admire very tall buildings, and some people don't aesthetically, but putting the aesthetics aside, I think that there's going to be a kind of growing consensus that figuring out some kind of financial feedback loops to make sure that the people who are benefiting or investing enormous amounts of money in kind of apartments in the sky are also supporting the services that they benefit from and other things, in tax structures or others. It's probably going to gain currency. I don't kind of hold with either a utopian or dystopian vision of the future. I mean, I think that we are right now in a generation where cities are experiencing an incredible Renaissance rebirth. My guess is it's going to spread from the very large cities even to other kind of second and third tier cities, and that urban living is going to, at least in the United States, is going to go through a pretty extended period of growth and success, and that kind of how you reconcile this extreme wealth and extreme height with what's happening down on the ground or in isolated pockets is going to depend to a large degree on the kind of structures that we have in place, and I guess I'll say kind of institutional structures, if we have the capacity to take some of that prosperity and some of that growth and feed it back into the communities that need it, and then also whether we create kind of hard connections between these communities. I mean, I believe that one of the wonderful things about New York City is that rich and poor people alike, a lot of them get on the subway. And they kind of mingle. They might be living in different places, their kids might be going to different schools, they might be living very different lifestyles, but there are parts, whether it's Central Park or the Lex line or something, where they have to jostle up against people from other walks of life, and I think that's a good thing. I think that kind of creating more diversity within our urban communities is all to the good and something we've got to encourage. I think that the poor door phenomenon, for instance, is, even while maybe it got blown out of proportion, I think it's kind of important that you not allow there to be too much of that any time you can break down segregation is a good thing. And that there's a kind of, there can be real but also kind of implicit segregation, and that's important too.
Great. Anyone else on that subject?
I will say that equity, I think, is actually achieved through public space. And I think that if you do take the example of Central Park and the Lex line, but you kind of expound upon that by Brooklyn Bridge Park, the High Line to a degree, the Battery Park. These are areas that actually allow people to inhabit them and to have those kind of moments of exchange that are incredibly important. And the question that I would have and would place out to the developers and the investors and all of the creation of these sort of living, working towers is who and how do these public spaces get funded so that spaces like Brooklyn Bridge Park and spaces like the High Line, or these beneficial spaces for the city, it is a responsibility for all of us to actually find ways of making them and maintaining them, because these are the areas that we all benefit from.
Right. I think if I can jump on that, I think that there's an interesting thing that's happening in New York right now is that we just came out of 12 years of the Bloomberg administration, which were not originally, but became wonderful champions of these kinds of investments. They supported the High Line from day one, say, but they really became known for Times Square and what that whole team did. And Bloomberg was, the billionaire kind of, supposedly, but he cared about these things. We shifted to a mayor who gets elected because of his talk about two cities and bringing them together and social equity issues. And yet, a lot of what they're pursuing is very similar, is building on what the Bloomberg administration did. And it might have more emphasis on the social, it might be more explicit in how they talk about that. The Parks Commissioner, Mitch Silver, is kind of a real champion of these things, say. But it's still kind of, it's picking up that torch and carrying it forward. It's not a reversal of the Bloomberg administration legacy, it's just the opposite. And I think that that's, even though to the common perception was that these would be two very, very different mayors, I think that in many ways they're pursuing a common agenda. And I think it points out exactly to what you're saying, that these are public and kind of spaces that create social capital.
Right, and I mean that kind of ties into the idea of, you hear these backlash about the High Line, besides the complaints about tourists, which every New Yorker has to do, about every place that's popular. But specifically, you hear about, this is a handout to developers, because now this area around the High Line is revitalized, and there are all these projects going up, and people are put off by the fact that they're generally for higher income, occupants. But it's an incredible asset of public space. What I was going to ask about, though, was what do we think will be the High Line of 2050? You know, what's the next piece of disused infrastructure that needs a little bit of attention right now and could potentially, you know, drive the future controversy over how we've ruined another neighborhood with development, construction.
I would like to just sort of, you know, the last time the CTBUH was in New York was 10 years ago, 2005. It was the first conference ever. I would love for anyone of us sitting there 10 years ago to actually have been able to envision what New York would be like with all of these public spaces. It would be very difficult to actually explain the phenomena that has happened in 10 years, let alone what we're being asked to do right now and sort of looking at 35 years. You can, everyone out there, make changes and do huge things in a lifetime and maybe do a few things that are really transformative to the same degree as investments in public space or buildings that serve as catalysts to make people's perception of a place different. So I would sort of say these places are in every city, and it is just sort of, you know, sometimes a single visionary, but most often it's sort of leadership through several personalities on the policy front and on the sort of private investment fund front that are able to unlock the potential of a site or of a infrastructure of a place. You know, just to sort of talk about the regional planning, New York was and is, I guess, completely a imprint of capitalism. It is the perfect sort of diagram of capitalism. And then when the industry left, and the edge, which was formerly black, let's say, black in terms of soot, pollution, kind of like awful water. It's still awful water. So we still have some things to clean up. Maybe the water is the next High Line.
Is the next High Line,
It is
yeah.
the next High Line, I think. If we clean our water, we could create the most amazing city. But if you think about what also has transformed from sort of becoming an area that you would move away from because of pollution and because of soot and because of crime and anything else that would be on there, and you look at the New York today, the people that are actually moving to the edge, moving to the water, wanting to live there and recreate there, that is that's amazing that that's occurred in a lifetime.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not maybe the High Line necessarily. Governor's Island is the one that jumps to my mind. And folks, now it is discovered. I mean, thousands of people go there on weekends in the summer. But the harbor is now the new Central Park to New York. And the ringing of the harbor and Governor's Island in the middle of it during the summer months, it's a wonderful place to go and and every single year it dramatically increases the number of people who are going. And the obvious kind of answer, I think, to the criticism of the High Line being just for elites is, well, we should have more of them then, and that every neighborhood should get its High Line, and it shouldn't just be for a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Chelsea in the meatpacking district, but there should be, and there are proposals, of course, TPL, the Trust for Public Land, has a proposal to do one in Queens, and there are lots of other ideas. And I think that one of the really exciting legacies, again, of the last 15 years that we've been through, the most important thing I think that the city DOT did with its bike lanes and Times Square and other stuff was not any specific intervention, but kind of reminding citizens that things could change. Because it used to be that they would spend 5 years just studying whether to stick a damn bollard on a sidewalk or not. I mean, things moved so slowly in the old bureaucracy. And I think that the DOT, the great DOT commissioner, Jeanette Sada-Khan, and her team that came in, they just started, we'll invent things and we'll experiment. And if it works, we leave it. And if it doesn't, we tear it out. And you see, so we had earlier this year, Vornado just throw in some public spaces around Penn Station, which is one of the kind of most pathetic public spaces in the city that has enormous amounts of foot traffic and value. And one of them worked and the other didn't, and so they ripped that one out. And it's a kind of making sure that cities are a living, dynamic thing is really critical. And we've gotten that back in New York. And I think that's how the next High Line and these other things will come forward. And I completely agree. I think the water's edge is where, whether it's Red Hook or Jersey City or Governor's Island, there are enormous number of sites and opportunities for these kinds of interventions. The danger, of course, is that if we put them too close to the water, they'll all be underwater by 2050.
Right. But I mean, of course, your argument would be, well, we could design them in such a way that they could become part of the defense mechanism of the city, as well as a discrete intervention that improves public life.
Yeah, this is a plug for all the duchies in the room. I mean, the Netherlands has lived under the waters table for 400 or 500 years. So it is a proven fact that that one can actually create habitable spaces underwater.
There's still hope for the Rockaways.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that some of the recent indicators that I've seen that have brought the tall building world's attention to New York, are indicative of something, and I'd be interested in getting your opinions on that. So we have this Cornell University campus that's going up on Roosevelt Island. It's going to have the tallest passive house development in history so far. We just heard the announcement that the U.S. Agriculture Department tall wood building competition has awarded a project that was designed by Shop. They're going to give them the funding to actually experiment and build a all wood building, mostly wood building, a tall building on 18th Street. So are there other projects that we may not be aware of, or that you would expect or hope to see coming down the line that would continue to kind of give New York a credit as a leader in sustainable tall development?
I have a short list.
You have a short list.
The point Russell elaborated on, climate change, carbon emissions from New York City, of course, are concentrated in buildings. And what the modeling shows is that even with very aggressive targets for energy conservation, at some point, kind of in the current paradigm, there'll still be combustion of fossil fuels happening in buildings, right? We're in a heating-dominated climate during that season. And so we will only get to the 80 by 50 target if we start to electrify buildings, meaning eliminate entirely the burning of dead dinosaurs in your living room, right? That just has to be behind us. So one of the aspirations that I hope we can see in pilots like the Roosevelt Island Cornell Tech site is new construction really showcasing advanced heat pump technology to heat buildings electrically without the use of fossil fuels. Another significant threshold that we just have to get past is how we construct envelopes. We're now 65 years into a practice of using aluminum for curtain wall systems. And aluminum is a superconductor of heat. And we're building state-of-the-art buildings with envelopes with an R value of 3. When a single-family mass developer track house in New Jersey is building our wall assemblies with R values of 20.
Right.
And so that is a fundamental barrier we have to cross. So I hope we could see the first building, curtain wall, window wall, that doesn't use aluminum, that achieves an R value, multiples higher than we're seeing now. So there's a couple.
I think if you look at the history of at least green building, it was institutional owners that kind of were the first innovators, and then the private sector that participated in that work then became the next innovators. So, with green building in New York, it was a city agency that had high performance building guidelines before there was a DDC. There was Battery Park City Authority on the on the west side, which started requiring LEED. There was a city law requiring LEED, and that created that was a training ground for the first generation of designers and contractors and developers in Battery Park City's case that were working on green building, with a couple exceptions like the DERS. And so that's where the next innovation is going to happen. I mean, you mentioned the Cornell building, institutional owner on former city land, not a coincidence. And looking at the ambitions of the current city and state government, I think we are going to see significant incentives to kind of bring along the next generation of kind of low energy buildings, and many of those will be high rise. I mean, use the example of Passive House on the Cornell building. It's been done in low-rise buildings. It's pretty straightforward. It's more expensive. The challenge there is how do you do that cheaply, but they know how to do it. There's not been much experience in high-rise, and I think you'll see in the next 5 years significant efforts between the city and the state to kind of stimulate not necessarily those exact standards, but kind of buildings approximating or trying to get there on the high-rise end.
So with all the pent-up demand for development that particularly in residential, that people don't see going away, we should expect by 2050 to see quite a few passive house high-rises then.
Something along those lines. I mean, they're different than the buildings you're seeing, they're featured in this conference. I mean, different market. I'm not.
Quite interesting. Well, I want to make sure I give this enough time for the audience to ask some questions. I know we have some roving microphones that can come around, so let's see if we can get some questions from the audience. Oh, you must be curious.
Before the audience gets a crack, I do have a question, Tom. It's one that sort of really pops up often. And I'm sure actually that each one of you sitting out in the audience thought about this as you were coming to the conference. It's that our airports are third world.
Sure.
As according to Joe Biden, the vice president.
He's the authority.
And we can see some movement.
Yeah.
The governor just released some ideas for LaGuardia. How important is basically the front door
Sure.
to New York for you and your regional plan thinking, and for the health of the city?
Thanks for asking that. That's a great question. We have, as part of our process for doing a regional plan, we have actually an international advisory group where I have kind of counterparts from around the world who I check in with once or twice a year. And we've done kind of retreats with the CEOs of transit properties and economic development, deputy mayors and things like that. One thing that's just amazing is how metropolitan regions that are much smaller than New York City are investing much more in their airports. And, and it shouldn't be that amazing. If you chart kind of economic growth in every city in the world over the last 100 years, and you kind of put over the ridership and the throughput of their airports and their growth, they completely track each other. I mean, you simply cannot see a kind of continuing prosperity without continued air travel. That's the argument we have, and yet we have essentially a hard cap. We get about something. I think it's a little over 110 million annual passengers a year traveling through Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark airports. And we did a study a couple of years ago about long-term growth, and by 2050, actually probably well before that, by current trends, we're going to need to be moving 150 million people through the two airports. That's two new LaGuardia airports. And we don't have that capacity in the existing airports. And we've looked at high-speed rail and pushing people to fly out of Philadelphia, or building an island in the middle of the harbor the way they would. And those are all really hard to do. So what's happening right now is there's kind of attention on the airports and talk about improving things at LaGuardia, which is nice. But I would say that at the end of the day, we have to start thinking both about how you get to those airports and kind of what kind of capacity they have. There are some technological, I've got in my pocket a kind of more complicated and savvy GPS system than a lot of planes have. We're still on radar-based air traffic control in this country. So moving to a national system of satellite controls, what's called next gen, would be an enormous improvement in terms of letting the planes fly closer together, and they can do curved routes instead of kind of tilting 15 degrees and things. But at the end of the day, we're going to need to be doing some probably much more dramatic improvements at our airports. And frankly, we're going to need it mostly at Kennedy and Newark, because most of the growth in air travel is international too, it's not domestic. And that's probably going to mean new runways at some point, which is a big deal, because if you've ever flown into one of our airports, you'd notice that Kennedy is surrounded by an urban community and then up against a national park. And Newark is essentially surrounded by an urban community and then up against the largest seaport on the Atlantic seaboard. So finding room to grow those airports is going to be extremely hard, extremely difficult. But I don't think we continue to grow this region's economy long term. We can survive another 10, 15, maybe 20 years, but we're going to need to see some real improvements in investment in and increase in capacity.
Who's the leader? Is it Port Authority? Like, who leads?
So it's the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey that manages the 3 airports. And there's kind of one argument that says it's a good system because it's essentially one integrated system. The Port Authority manages them. Different carriers are kind of concentrated in different airports, but to a large degree, the Port Authority kind of tries to run it as a single unified system. There are some people who say we ought to get away from that. I mean, what we've seen is that kind of municipal airport systems tend to have more competition, and that if we broke up the Port Authority and you had a Jersey Port Authority, a Jersey Airport Authority running Newark, and you had New York City, say, running Kennedy and LaGuardia, you would start to see more investment because they'd have to compete with each other. I don't know what the answer is in terms of that. There are also, very obvious things we ought to be doing yesterday about improving access to the airports. How many of you folks took a taxi from one of the airports to here? And did anybody have a good experience in it? Yeah. There's an air train system at Kennedy Airport that takes you to Jamaica and Queens, and then you have to transfer to the Long Island Railroad or the subway to get out there. It's kind of difficult. Not many people from out of town would do that. That system was designed to eliminate the transfer someday. There was no capacity at Penn Station or Grand Central, so there was no reason to try and bring a train all the way from Kennedy to, say, Penn Station. But we're building this thing called East Side Access. Half of the Long Island Railroad riders will stop going to Penn Station and will go to Grand Central in 10 years. And so we should probably think about connecting Kennedy Airport as a one-seat ride to Penn Station. And by the way, if you did that, you could also connect it to Grand Central. For the Newark Airport, we have a subway system called the Path, also owned and operated by the Port Authority, that's going to go from this beautiful Calatrava station in Lower Manhattan to downtown Newark. It's less than 2 miles from Newark Airport. And so just extending that subway down 1.8 miles further down the Northeast Corridor and building a station there would allow people to take the air train at Newark Airport to switch to the Path and take that either to Lower Manhattan or even to Herald Square at 34th Street. So there are projects that are kind of hiding in plain sight for us to work on. And I would argue we ought to be doing those things immediately and then thinking about how we actually create the new capacity for those extra 40 million annual passengers. And we're not going to get it just with new central terminals or other things. It's going to take some really tough choices. But again, I think to keep growing this economy in this region, we've got to do that. And Vienna, and I mean, much smaller cities than us are investing much more in their airport systems than we are. It's really kind of a shocking situation. So thank you, Kai.
Yes.
Is there any regulation in New York for developer to have compulsory project manager engagement?
No.
As an independent entity, an independent company?
Yes.
No, there's no requirement now.
Okay, thanks.
There was another question right here in the middle.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a point that Tom made there. My name's Nick Searle. I'm from London. And I was at an event in London last week where the Estates Gazette, which is one of the big property press publications, announced its top 50 collaborators. And the winner, quite extraordinarily, was Transport for London. And I think if you'd said that 5 years ago, people would have been, well, it wouldn't have happened and people just wouldn't have believed it. But it is symptomatic of a mindset that seems to have embedded itself in London, where people place huge value now on investment into quite small scale, but multiple transport upgrades. And what Transport for London are doing, and the reason they won this, was because they've taken several hundred sites and they're structuring a framework with the private sector to bring forward developments around each of those sites which are on top of transport nodes, which upgrades the individual transport node with private money, but also creates a profit that then gets fed back into the system generally. That's an example of something that's happened, and there's the Crossrail things and other things as well. But I just wondered if you were to kind of tear up the various different layers of bureaucracy that you mentioned, and just say, you know, if there was one great collaboration that would make a difference to this city, what would it be?
Right. That's, I mean, and TfL is something we've studied quite seriously and have thought about. Is one of our answers actually to try and devolve more authority to the city? And I don't know if that's the answer, and probably it isn't, because we really do have a metropolitan economy. But TfL has been doing extraordinary innovative things, and they are kind of from the fare integrated structure to the new investments to just the piecemeal improvements. And just two things to kind of compare to New York. I mean, one, the Second Avenue subway required the MTA to buy parcels of land on the Upper East Side so that they could put their stations in them. And, you know, this is valuable land. They paid a lot of money for it, and it's about to become a lot more valuable because there are going to be tens of thousands of people every hour streaming through those sites. And if you want to just kind of go have a case study in missed opportunities, travel up and down Second Avenue and look at the banal boxes that they built that look like bomb shelters on each of those stations. That's public property now that's been overbuilt with absolutely no economic value, essentially. And it's just a disgrace, and nowhere else in the world would they do that. The other, of course, would be just anytime you try and ride any of our mass transit systems, think about how many different fare collection systems you have to have, whether you're riding Metro North or the Long Island Railroad or New Jersey Transit or the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak, or the subways. And of course, we don't have any kind of integrated fare structure. And we're using, you know, the state-of-the-art circa 1990 technology to do it. And frankly, you know, despite it being in the capital plan, really a kind of any improvement in this is in the far distant future. So we have a system that kind of stamps out any type of innovation. I think that what I kind of talked about a little bit earlier about trying to figure out how to break the operations away from the financing and planning is probably the way to go. And long term, maybe we should look at Stockholm, which is another interesting one, where Stockholm kind of took the operations and they bid it out for a concession, and it was Hong Kong that won. And MTR people, and they have the nice little MTR logo on their uniforms, are there cleaning up and operating and maintaining the Stockholm subway system. And my guess is that's through a system that's returning much more value to the riders and to the city of Stockholm than kind of just having patched things over with an existing structure would have done.
There's a question.
Yes. First, I'd really like to compliment the panel on your knowledge and your depth of thinking. You touched three subjects which happen to be dear to my heart. And they have a commonality, although you might not think it. The High Line, the issues of rebuilding of the office building structure in our city, and affordable housing. Affordable in the sense of affordable, not necessarily what many people will think of as in the terms of the lowest common denominator. But there's something tied to all three. The High Line was envisioned and created really by a group of citizens. They came to the city, they got us enthused. It was standing there for years and years decrepit, dead rail line. By virtue of the rezoning of that area, you have what you have today with hundreds of millions of dollars in income to the city and the state as a result, as well as a tourist attraction. It was rezoning. With respect to the issues of office buildings, it's pretty hard for a developer to make the pencil work when, in order to take down a building that is 60 or 70 years old, he has to contemplate 5 years or more of a vacant piece of land. He's got to demolish, he's got to draw, he's got to build, and he's paying taxes all the while. So you can't, and at the end of the day, under current law, all he can build is what he had to begin with. The FAR hasn't improved. The City of New York, on at least one site immediately right now on Vanderbilt Avenue, has changed the zoning requirements, has given the developer the opportunity to build higher, and we have also extracted, and I think that's a fair word, we've extracted from the developer several $100 million towards the improvements in Grand Central Station. So while the City of New York has been giving, it's been getting. With regard to the third issue of housing, as was mentioned earlier, the Bloomberg administration was a great administration. I'm a member of City Planning Commission, and I've had the good fortune to sit through Giuliani, through Blumenthal, and now through de Blasio. And I've seen a lot going in the past 20 years. But with regard to housing, Blumenthal had instituted 20% affordable housing over a spectrum of incomes from 30% of average income to maybe 150% of average income. And the developers somehow found that between that and the other subsidies, it made sense for them to do it. The planning now is to even grow that. They are now being required to put in affordable housing of 20 to 30% or even more. If they can't do it, we're not talking center city. I'm not talking center city at all. I'm talking the periphery. But by giving additional FAR to these developers, we don't have land to give, but we have air to give. Okay? Developers have found a way to take land and the air from the guy next door and build higher. Well, we're trying to help them. And the commonality of all of these items that I've discussed with you is zoning. The ability of zoning to, I don't think too many people realize how potent zoning can be and how potent the zoning change can be. So while you have discussed very well the subjects, I would argue that more emphasis should be put on ways to get the zoning improved, to give the developer the extras that he needs, and that's good politics, it's good business. The Brooklyn Park was built because of subsidies. The Brooklyn Park was built because they put in public housing, not public housing, excuse me, they put in affordable housing.
Are we working up to a question here?
Not yet, I'm done.
Well, to Bloomberg's, I think, credit that the last bill or the last thing that I know that went to a vote was actually Midtown's rezoning and easement, and it was not passed. So I would say it is something that is very current, and it is on. I think it is something that needs to be addressed. The sort of Midtown office of the 50s and 60s, and I think the responsibility of that is actually one of energy. The sort of, I would say, largest users of energy are probably the building stock that was built sort of from the 50s through the 80s. And that, you know, we can talk about sustainability and LEED all we want, but new construction is a small percentage of existing stock. So what we really should be talking about, or make more sexy, so that more people are interested, is actually looking at existing buildings, and I would say have to just sort of have a set of tools to start addressing these, whether there's a turnover of lease or whether there's in some steps, incremental steps, to deal with the midtown.
And of course, the industry has decades of experience using zoning bonuses, right, as a lever. So it's certainly something familiar to the development community, the design community, and Russell, right, for sure, that's being discussed and contemplated, in the city's planning around climate reduction.
Yeah.
The idea of zoning bonuses being an incentive. So the point is spot on.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised if we don't see something come out of this administration looking at zoning not just as a way to stimulate affordable housing, but also kind of, again, next generation low energy buildings. And we don't know quite the form it'll take, but I think we're going to see it. It's one of the no-brainer ideas out there.
Thank you. Ashok Raji from Arab. So I have a couple of questions. They both relate to change. So it's clear that we're undergoing a real change in demography in our city. The baby boomers are retiring and the young techies are moving in. And I think by 2050 there'll be another generational change. And the question then is really, what are we doing as a city to really prepare for that? So that's the first question. And the second question is about change that's arising out of a disruptive technology, and that's the autonomous vehicle and what impact that will have on our city, and is actually anybody studying that?
I could take a whack at both of those. The demographic change is significant. I mean, we're anticipating over the next 25, 30 years the possibility for, if we have the capacity and the systems, to see about 4 million more people move into this metropolitan region, but 3 million of them will be over 65. Not kind of 3 million new over, but the population will grow. The over 65 will be where we see the growth. And the question is, if we grow rapidly, we will manage to maintain our workforce age population, and if we don't grow rapidly, we will see a decline in the number of people between the ages of 22 and 58, say, in this region. Even as the population increases, we will see fewer people within that age cohort, those age cohorts. And so we would kind of argue we'd better be able to figure out how to keep growing. Otherwise, there will be even fewer people kind of working to keep an economy going for more people who are retired, unless we stop retiring at 65, which is also a good possibility, but kind of, so we know we're going to shift towards the older end of the spectrum, and that I think my conclusion from that is we better do more to attract the younger folks, and what I'm talking about is people who will be 45 years old in 25 years, essentially. I think for the second on the autonomous, yes, there are a lot of people, and I would lead with the auto industry is probably spending more time and, of course, investing in these new cars and the self-driving cars. And whether they're kind of 3 years away or 5 years away or 10 years away, it's clear that we're going to move to them. And I think we cannot, I mean, I have friends in the transportation planning business who think this is just going to be terrible. And that essentially all the gains we've made in mass transit ridership are going to be undone the moment people can just have their cars kind of drive them in, and then they'll get out and they'll tell the car to go drive around the Upper West Side for a few hours and then come and pick them up later, which is a scary thought in terms of traffic congestion and what we would do. Mm-hmm. And I got to think that won't happen because we'll put in place a regulatory structure to kind of limit it. But there certainly is the kind of possibility of unintended consequences with that. I think that the other, in terms of the technology, the other big thing, though, will be the kind of sharing economy. You know, what Zipcar says that every space they put in replaces something like 12 regular spaces. And so, you know, maybe to your question about the High Line and what will be the unused infrastructure that we'll have to turn over, it'll be all those empty parking garages, which would be a nice thing. Since kind of every good mixed-use redevelopment project outside New York City in this region, in a Bridgeport or a Newark or a White Plains, is probably financially underwater because of the cost of the structured parking. it would be a really nice future to think that we don't have to provide all that parking. And I think and so I think the kind of growth of the sharing economy, and especially what it means for vehicles, is going to be very good. So there are kind of possibly positive outcomes and possibly negative ones. And I think that there are definitely people, I mean, I don't know if you followed the blow up between the city and Uber just earlier this year, and what's going to come of that. I think it's fairly obvious that Uber will probably start to get some fees attached to their system, but whether it goes further than that is anybody's guess. And that'll
So,
be
Tom, I would like to, I think that the sharing economy, where the vehicle is now replacing 11 other or 12 vehicles, is actually has more of an impact urbanistically on cities. And I think that right now we're looking at 28 acres of downtown Pittsburgh. The beautiful thing, it's located right in the central business district, adjacent to it. It was a former Pittsburgh Penguins hockey arena that has been taken down, and the sea of asphalt, which was the parking, is now open land to be developed. So it's basically from scratch. The beautiful thing is that the city, back in the day, did not have a parking requirement for those sites. Zero. Because you can literally walk to any bus, you can walk to downtown, 5 minutes. Now, will there be a developer that's willing to build on any of those parcels in those 28 acres with no parking? Perhaps not. But could an Uber actually consider investing in a housing project that solidifies their clientele, which is if there's no parking in the building, then they're going to be taking Ubers everywhere. So could you actually take a technology company, give them an urban kind of story, pitch, and say, you actually could create an urbanism for that basically feeds into your technology.
right.
And I find those instances to be really interesting for what the next 35, 40 years holds.
There's a wonderful kind of reverse engineering here too. When you think about it, we created the automobile companies came up in the beginning of the last century, and they needed to figure out a way to allow people to afford them. So they created the General Motors Assistance Corporation and financing arms to kind of make sure that the uptake of their technology would fit. And there's something, I think, in a way, it's almost kind of reversing that to say now we have these new mobility companies. And I think Zipcar in the same way, developers should essentially be saying, no, there's no built-in parking in this building, but I'm going to, your rent will also cover your annual Zipcar membership. And so you'll have an automobile at your beck and call. But there's a neat kind of reverse engineering to what you just laid out, where these technology companies would start to get back into financing the kind of growth that builds their business.